So there are also organisms that live inside of us, some of these mutualistic symbionts that take part in fighting off pathogens. Um, and here's an example with aphids who are parasitized by a particular fungus, but those aphids that have this symbiont present in them are better able to fight off the pathogen and survive compared to those that lack the symbiont and are much more susceptible to the pathogen. This idea, when you think about it, makes sense because, of course, these mutualistic symbionts that live inside of us are depending on us to be their home. And if some pathogen kills your home, that's not a good thing for you. So you can imagine evolution and selection favoring these mutualistic symbionts that help their host to survive in the face of these pathogens. All right, now the parasites have ways of um, getting access to their host. Of course, this thing, like an aphid, which sucks the juice out of plants, has a mouth part that allows it to penetrate the outer coverings of the plant, essentially the outer protective covering. Um, Encapsulation is a process that organisms have in response, or some organisms have in response to a pathogen. So, for example, these bacteria have been surrounded by a material that essentially isolates them and keeps them from reproducing or damaging the host. But the pathogens also have ways of resisting encapsulation. Um, so this brings up the notion that essentially sometimes the relationship between pathogens and host is described as a evolutionary arms race. Perhaps you've heard of the arms race in terms of the relationship between the former Soviet Union and the United States, where they each were trying to build bigger and better bombs. Well, essentially, coevolution of these pathogens and hosts can lead to these response and counter response in host and pathogen to try to keep from being parasitized and also make it such that the parasite can still take advantage of the host. um, and this, of course, involves genes, the genetic um, constitution that we have, and so you can get selection for particular genes that can allow the pathogen to access their host. It talks in the book about uh, um, the plasmodium that causes malaria and how it depends on, part of its stage depends on residing in red blood cells. Red blood cells um, are not terribly active cells. That is, they of course carry oxygen and carbon dioxide around the system, but they're made once they're made, they don't grow, they don't reproduce, they don't do a lot of the things that some of the things that other cells do. And they because of that, they do have a fairly short lifespan, but your body just makes more of them. So they don't take in a lot of materials and energy. And of course, when you're a parasite living inside them, that's something you need. And so there are genes that the malarial parasite has that basically allows it to modify red blood cells such that those red blood cells will then acquire materials and energy they would not otherwise acquire, thus helping the parasite. All right, so let's move on to concept 3. Again, these parasites and hosts will co-evolve in response to each other. So um, here's a good example. Rabbits were introduced into Australia a long time ago. In fact, it was the mid-1800s. They found a suitable habitat and fewer predators, and so their numbers just went through the roof. There were, millions and millions of them, and they were eating all a bunch of vegetation. Um, so in the 1950s, a virus was introduced um, that parasitizes rabbits, and um, it was so successful that it essentially killed 99.8% of the rabbits. So millions of rabbits were killed by this parasite. Well, what about those few rabbits that did survive? Well, they tended to be somewhat resistant to this virus, so that through time, when you had, after the initial exposure to this virus, the subsequent populations of rabbits were more and more resistant to the pathogen. Um, and you can see that over here, the lethality of the virus. So early on, the virus was extremely lethal. Like I said, it killed, what was it, 99.8% of them. But through time, because of the development of resistance to it in the rabbits, it became much less um, virulent or deadly, and has sort of settled into a relatively stable, moderate level of of pathogenicity, such that it still kills some of the rabbits, but there is enough resistance out there that it doesn't kill all the rabbits. So indeed, hosts and parasites are good examples of coevolution when two interacting species are evolving in response to each other. Um, just like I described a little earlier with an evolutionary arms race. So you introduce a virus that's very deadly, but then those few rabbits that do survive have the genes that allow them to survive, and they'll pass it on. The virus may mutate and change, but again, it just kind of one responds to the other, and it tends to reach sort of an equilibrium after a period of time. So indeed, genes and their interactions are very important. So when it comes to pathogens, certain types of organisms, plants are well known for this. They'll have particular genes that give them an increased resistance to a pathogen. So you can see here there's two different genotypes of the pathogen and two different host genotypes. And so there's various combinations where you'll lead to disease, but this particular combination, essentially host genotype R, is resistant to pathogen genotype A. And so in the presence of this pathogen, you'll get presumably a higher frequency of this particular gene, this genotype, leading to increased resistance. Um, in this study, these folks were looking at snails and a particular parasite that they have. And what they found was that when a population was exposed to parasites of from its own population, there tend to be higher levels of infection. So this particular population here, the M population, which is shown with the orange bar, when those snails from that population are exposed to the parasite that normally resides in their population, they're relatively strong, negatively affected. However, when they're exposed to parasites from the other populations, the W and P populations, they have a much lower level of infection. And we see the same thing here. When the W snails are exposed to the parasite from their population, it's higher, but it's lower for the others. And the same with the P population. Um, essentially, the thinking there is that, for example, the W and P populations are not normally exposed to this parasite, and so when the parasite is presented, they have a combination of genes that are able to increase its resistance. Now, under prolonged exposure, that situation could change with, of course, the parasite evolving ways to get around that resistance. Um, but when these populations are, again, not normally exposed to it, they, at least with this combination of organisms, they have the genes that allow them to resist the pathogen. Your probability of being parasitized can also depend on how frequency your particular type is. So here we have these one species of snail, but 5 different genotypes, 5 types that have different combinations of genes. And so you can see that this particular genotype has the lowest rate of infection. It also happens to be the least common of the 5 genotypes. That is, the parasite is more successful at infecting the 4 genotypes that are more common. We're going to talk specifically about evolution later, but we'll see in evolution speak, this is what's known as frequency dependent selection, and that is the pathogen is taking advantage of those individuals that are more common, whereas the one that's less common and is simply fewer of them in the population is less likely to be parasitized. And in this case, it also has a combination of genes that allows it to resist the pathogen. Now, you would think over time that because these guys are being hit hard by the pathogen and this guy is not, that these guys should become less frequent and this guy becomes more frequent. And that's indeed the case. That can happen. In which case, what you would expect is that this one would then have higher parasite loads as it increases in frequency, and these would have less. And so the situation can wax and wane, where at any given time, what's again less common will tend not to be parasitized as much, but it might become more common later and be more highly parasitized. Now, all of this competition, if you will, or conflict between hosts and parasites is costly. That is when some adaptation is developed that gives you an advantage in terms of battling off a parasite, or if you're a parasite taking advantage of a host. These things often have costs because of these things we've talked about, trade-offs. And so a host that develops an adaptation against some particular compound, for example, biochemical, some compound that allows them to battle that pathogen, it's not necessarily free to produce that compound. That is, there's a physiological cost of producing that compound, and so that can decrease, for example, the ability of that organism to reproduce. So they're more resistant to the pathogen, but yet they reproduce at a lower rate. And so, again, that resistance, that ability to fight the pathogen comes at a cost. And that's what we see with this fungus known as a rust type of fungus that infects flax, a plant. And essentially, when the rust has a greater number of genes that it makes use of to overcome the defenses of the flax, the plant, it has lower reproductive rates than rust genotypes that have fewer genes to overcome resistance. They have a much higher reproductive output. That is, they produce more spores. So again, there's a trade-off. You can have the ability to overcome the resistance of the host, but because of that cost, you can't reproduce as much, versus higher reproductive rates mean you can't put as much effort into evading the host's defenses. All right, so we'll stop there and pick up the next 2 sections in the next video.